Hello, everyone. So, since today's guest speaks very good, I should say, very good conversational German and has worked a lot with Germans, I thought it would be appropriate to do a blooper from Germany. And this was a sign in English in the Black Forest where it said, and this was actually much longer, what I'm going to read to you is an abridgment of this sign. And it says in English, "It is strictly forbidden on our Black Forest camping site that people of different sex, for instance, men and women, live together in one tent unless they are married for this purpose." So, with that, today's guest is Dr. Ellen Moran. Ellen is a business psychologist and executive coach certified by the International Coach Federation, as well as being a speaker and a facilitator. She speaks good conversational German, and she works with leaders of major companies and their teams, both in the US and abroad, primarily in Germany and Switzerland, to create collaborative conversations, cultures, and work climates, because even though the words may be correct, people may still not connect. Her main focus is to equip business leaders to spark employees' creativity and connection to the business mission and the purpose. So welcome, Ellen. Delighted that you're with us.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here.
So before we begin, perhaps you could tell us a bit about your background and how you gained your doctorate and your different degrees in psychology and how you became the profession that you are.
Sure. My father was a physician, and so I came by the whole idea of professions like that and professions of service to be important. And I found in college that I had a real affinity for psychology, even over biology and medical things. And so I, during that time that I was in college, I also have had an abiding interest in my roots. My maiden name was Gutenkauf, which is very German. And my grandmothers on both sides had told me stories, some from Germany and some from Switzerland, about different experiences. And this was really kind of put me on fire. So this was a second sort of passion of mine. And when I was 19, I had the opportunity to go to an immersion language school in what we would say Cologne, Germany. And there for 3 months, I was in classes with people from every other country imaginable, but we could only have German as our common language. And I lived with a German family. So out of that experience, I came out speaking pretty good conversational German. I continued with my psychology studies and got an assistantship to graduate school, was going into clinical psychology, but was determined to get back to Germany. Through a story that's much too long to tell, I wound up, through some German professors I met in Chicago, getting an assistantship in the clinical psychology department at the University of Munich. When I got there, because I spoke good conversational German, the professors there decided that what they ought to do is give me their journal articles and see if they couldn't be translated to be in American journals. The first one of these, from the chair of the department, translated into English, is Psychoanalytic Observations on Belief and Unbelief. And the other was equally abstruse. So I had to disabuse them of the notion that that was what they were going to get from my being there. They weren't quite sure what to do with me in my American ways. And so I made a little, and I was in offices with all the others were PhDs, because the woman whose office I had was on sabbatical. So I wrote a little sign that said, "Fräulein Ellen Gutenkauf, hier wird Amerikanisch gesprochen," or American spoken here, because they distinguished English from American. Right. The German society, even in the university, is very hierarchical. So at a certain point, the professor, the head of the department, decided that he really didn't want to teach the course in neuroses that he was supposed to teach. He wanted to teach anthropology, which was his love. So he assigned each one of the professors one of the neuroses to write a paper on. I was then asked to carry these into the lecture hall. And what happened was a competition that ensued. So my first, and I had to mimeograph them and so forth and carry them in. So I could sell the content for a Mark 15, and they could have their content, and he could talk about anthropology. Each week, my box got heavier because each professor decided to make one that was just a little better and a little more dense than the one before him. They didn't quite know what to do with me from a number of things, so they gave me a diminutive, and they turned my name Gutenkauf into Gutenkäufchen, which is little Gutenkauf, but then we all would use the formal form of Z. So that was a pretty fun time. I came back then and finished my degree in clinical psychology, and really was disappointed to find out that that was the year that the German exam was no longer required as for entrance. So, and then I went on.
Exam.
Pardon?
A German language exam.
A German language exam, yes. You had to have a foreign language exam, but it was no longer at that time. So I continued with my work in clinical psychology, received my PhD, worked for the juvenile court for a while, and also did some work in pre-sentence investigations. Once I was out on my own, I was asked to do some testimony in a couple of capital murder cases. And that's what pretty much made me decide that I no longer wanted to do that kind of work, because it seemed like everyone was trying to, whether it was the defense or the prosecution, shape my testimony to get the outcome that they wanted. I continued with that until on a soccer field with one of my 3 children playing, someone came up and told me about these marvelous psychologists who were helping him find a new job in outplacement. And I said, "What's outplacement?" But because I did a lot of testing and was curious, about a month later, I was interviewing at an outplacement firm, a global one, Drake Beam Moran, and decided that I really liked this kind of work. I could be more of myself. And there was a whole number of reasons why people weren't able to make it in the jobs they'd had. And some of them had to do with culture fit issues or the wrong person for, they just were the wrong person for the role. And when you would interview them, they would start out by saying, "When I was in high school, my guidance counselor said, you're good at this, so you should always, you should think about this career." So it was really fascinating to see how when people got psychological testing, they were able to see other careers that might be better for them given their characteristics. And often they found positions after that that were much better than the ones they had.
Let me stop you there, because that is fascinating, but in the interest of time, that leads to some other questions that I have.
Sure.
So since you're talking about, I guess, psychology and fit and so forth, I know that you've worked both with Germans and with Swiss. Could you give us some examples of differences or similarities between the Germans and the Swiss? Because to many Americans, perhaps they all speak German, they're all alike, and that's not quite true.
Well, it's not true at all. The first major difference is the language itself. If you speak High German or regular German, you may understand about a half, if you're lucky, of what the Swiss have to say, because their form of German is very melodic, and they're very, very different words that are used. And in one engagement, they kind of had fun with me. I was over in Switzerland, and it was a breakout room, and they said, do we have to use High German? Can we go? I said, okay, go ahead. And so as I listened to it, I thought I got about 50% of it. And afterwards they looked at me smiling like, haha. And I said, well, from the part of it I got, this is what I think the issue is for you. And then it was, oh, I guess she got the right part. The other thing that's that I've noticed that's a little different is that the Germans seem to be a bit more direct. in their communication. And what I've noticed often in talking with them is they'll punctuate their sentences at the end with the word klar, meaning, is it clear? Or that's clear, isn't it? So they want to be sure that you have gotten the right message and that it has been crystal clear what they were saying. So that's one thing that I have noticed. Now, even within Germany, you'll find differences between the Northern and the Southern Germans. And the Southern Germans, again, they have an unflattering phrase for the Northern Germans, which is back to the Prussian days, and they would say "Sau Preuße," and so the
and what does that mean?
Pig Prussian.
Pig Prussian. Oh, that's Sal. Okay.
So yeah, and the Bavarians are often presented as people in they're sort of like what we would call hayseeds, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So there's that difference also, even within Germany in different places. There's
that's fascinating.
Linguistic and personality differences.
From what other guests have said, and in general, Germany is perceived to be a more rigid society with a top-down management structure, which means that the boss decides the direction and what to do, and the other managers are to implement what the boss says to do. Yet your work is a lot more about collaboration, which involves participation and input of managers from lower levels and employees. How do you reconcile these two styles?
Well, the reconciliation is helping managers when I would do leadership development programs, helping them see the value of that. Now, what you'll find sometimes is that country culture is not as important sometimes as company culture, because there's been sort of a homogenization of certain practices, and particularly those that have had strong US influence. And so those will tend to have a bit more of that. But in my example of the university department, that was very much that hierarchical, this is what you'll do. I think that the formality, though, and another difference I would say between us as Americans and the Germans is typified by a engagement I had with a German colleague, also a psychologist, and we were to deliver to a group of German executives their 360 feedback reports, and we were going to then do that for the Americans too. The night before, we got together, and we're just trying to get ourselves coordinated, and he looked at the 360 feedback and he said, "Ellen, this won't work." And I said, "Why not?" He said, "Well, these phrases at the end, you know, the comments that people make, they aren't full sentences. They're only partial sentences sometimes." And I said, well, Wolfgang, we just do what they write." And he said, "Yes, Ellen, but," he said, "if there are mistakes in the text, they may think that the whole thing is not to be believed."
Wow.
And I said, "Well, okay."
This was in English, is that right?
We were talking in English. Well, we were going back and forth in English, but we were going to be presenting in German to these German executives.
Oh, in German. Okay. Yes.
So, and he was thinking about his audience and saying, "This just won't fly." And so finally I said, "Well, Wolfgang, I'm not from your culture. So if this is what you think needs to be done, I'll defer to you." And I said, but just a minute, how before we go, yeah, I said, "Well, what do you think you'll have to do?" And he said, "Well, I'll have to go home and retype this." And I said, "So Wolfgang, what percentage of this do you think is off?" And he said, "Oh, about 5%. And I just looked at him, and this is sort of a German, I said, "Na ja?" And he said, "Oh, you Americans, you're so pragmatic. All right, we'll just go with it the way it is." So the next day, he has gone completely chill. And so we're having these conversations. he's pleasant, he's easy, and he goes on longer than the allotted time, because we had 4 of these to do in one day. And so after about the second one, I said, Wolfgang, I'm concerned that we're not going to get finished with all. He said, yeah, I think that's probably right, Ellen. We'll probably have to take one of them into the next day. And I said, well, Wolfgang, he said, Ellen, and he said this to me in German, who's the German now? Because I was more concerned about getting things done and on time and so forth. So it was a very interesting kind of back and forth in that regard.
That's very interesting. Thank you. But in terms of, I guess, again, this participatory style versus the top-down approach, the participatory style is more American, the top-down is more German. Do you find that German companies are open to the more participatory American style? Because that's basically what you're coaching, I believe.
Well, that's right. And that's why when recently, and this just was through happenstance, I ran into a few German executives who were walking in our neighborhood because their hotel is close to the company that has been the acquired company. And so they were over here to do some work in supply chain. And because I spoke German and we went back and forth, it kind of loosened up and we got talking about the differences between Germans and Americans. And I said, you know, the Germans are much more oriented towards thinking something through and what could be the problem with something. And the Americans are much more proactive and let's try it out and see how it works. And much more options oriented in that way. And she made an interesting comment to me. She said, when she tried to get information from the Americans over there, she said, they're always so bloomig, which means flowery. And from her perspective, the Americans weren't really direct about what they thought about something, but would try and couch it a little bit and a little nicer. This happened actually with Wolfgang and myself when we had to write the reports from the 360 feedback. Once he sent me his, I wrote 2 in English, he wrote 2 in German, and then we would translate the other one. And when I saw what he had written, I wrote back to him, Wolfgang, we would say in English, did you have razor blades for breakfast? Because I thought it was so critical. And he thought that mine was not really quite as direct as it needed to be to make the point.
Could you give some examples of blumig and how the Germans would say something, translating it from German, versus how the Americans would say something in English?
Well, the Germans would be just more direct in the statement, this is the way it is.
Or would they criticize a person, for example?
Yes, that when they would criticize, he has problems with this, you know, hat Probleme mit zuhören. And they had problems with listening. And the Americans might say, well, you know, it could be, he seems to have some potential problems with hearing and listening, right? So it would be couched a little bit more in the subjunctive rather than said straight out.
Right, with a passive voice.
Yeah.
It seems that, well, yes.
Yeah, and they would say, well, I got the sense from these others that rather than saying, this really is a problem and we're annoyed by it, they say, you know, some people could feel kind of offended by that. It would be that kind of a difference. And it's like, well, are they or aren't they is what they want to know. Just be clear.
That's fascinating. Thank you. What do you think, well, in your bio, you stated about hidden motivators that might trigger communication. Can you elaborate what that might mean?
Sure. In any situation we're in, we are looking at the situation through our own motivational filters, and we're expecting certain things. And when that doesn't come, when someone expresses it in an opposite language, it can create discord and so forth, even though there's no hostility whatsoever in it. So for example, an American might be talking about this wonderful idea and how it would be great and it would all the things we could accomplish from it and so forth. Meanwhile, the German counterpart could be thinking about what could go wrong that they aren't talking about. Okay. And so now we have, and so they might say, well, there could be a problem with this, and I see a problem here. Immediately, they get polarized. And so in one person's mind, you wouldn't be saying that and be that confident if you thought things through. The American might be thinking, you really are a wet blanket, and you're always trying to find a problem with something. All right. But they're really just expressing it in a different way. So one of the things I teach people is what we call influencing language. So if you're going to get a hearing from the other person, you need to express it in their language. So, for example, if the German person, and I'm stereotyping them just for the purposes of this program, this is right. We would all recognize this with our own colleagues, right? But you might say, well, I see where you're going with this. And if you want to get to that place, what have you thought about this? And what have you thought about that? And that's a way of beginning to raise the issue, but it's still much more in goal language. Conversely,
I'm sorry, and you said goal language, correct? G-O-A-L?
G-O-A-L, yeah. So we're moving toward a goal or away from a problem. Now, on the other side, if the person is very concerned about all the problems they have, you might say, well, yes, those certainly are problems, but there's probably a bigger problem if we don't consider this. So now we're still talking problem language, but we're getting our point across in that way. So it can go in, it can be heard.
Interesting.
And there are some of these and so there are a number of these motivational patterns. And typically, if something has gone wrong, I just ask people to tell me the conversation. What did you say? What did that person say? And often I can find where the motivational triggers are opposite each other. And then say, if you would just say it this way, that would be easier. Sometimes I can do it for cultures, and I'll just say, so in this culture, do people like to really get moving and make something happen? Or do they like to think it through first and be sure that they have everything considered before they move forward? And so I just go this way and this way. In this culture, is it important to set goals and go after them and meet them? Or is it important to prevent any potential problems? In this culture, is it important to have things carefully laid out step by step? Or is it important to have a lot of options? And people can tell you, if you phrase it that way, what's going on. And what I was just discussing before is that the Germans were more reactive. They want it thought through before they're going to take action, and the Americans are willing to give it a try.
Very interesting. It reminds me also of the concept of saving face, which is very Asian, but it's also Muslim. It's also Latin American. It's not so much in the United States, but the idea of thinking things through, coming up with a solution in advance before you speak is often a way that face-saving cultures would operate.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I had occasion to coach someone who was working with, he was going to be working with his Japanese team, and he was brought over to be the leader. And he had been there for a little while and was telling me
this person is American or Japanese?
This was American, and he was going to be brought over in this global company
to work with the Japanese team
of this Japanese team. And he complained to me that he was trying to be very inclusive and collaborative, as you've mentioned before. And so he brought up a certain topic and asked if anyone had any ideas. And of course, it was crickets. No one said anything. And they kind of looked at each other and looked down, but there was nothing said. And I said, well, my understanding of the Japanese culture is, first of all, that you don't have your own opinion if it might run counter to what the bosses would be. And if they can't know, that would be a little risky to do that. And secondly, you've asked it in a very options-oriented way. What different kinds of problems could there be? And that culture seems to be more procedural and step by step. So if you want to get ideas, one of the things I would recommend is that you first of all give a direction. I would now like each of you to think about something that didn't work well that you thought could be improved. And after you've thought about it, write it down, and then we'll go around the room and I'll have each of you tell us what is it that you thought could have been done differently. That may allow them, with their filters of being deferential, or what we call external to the boss, and procedural, to be able to respond. Because sometimes we'll say things in a way that, because it doesn't compute, it can't even go in. We don't get it.
Right. That's fascinating, very much. Before we began, you were talking about the German word influence, and how that's not a good word to use in German. So perhaps you could elaborate that, because that's similar to what you're just talking about.
Yeah, this was a case in which I was working with a German colleague, and we were delivering a leadership development program for this global team. And I was actually teaching this methodology that I've just been demonstrating here as part of the curriculum for them, so that they could communicate better with people above them, below them, and so forth. And in English, we would talk about this as being more influential and having the competency of influence. And when I went on about this, one of them finally said, "Ellen, we're not going to do that." And I said, "That isn't right." And I said, "Well, tell me more about that." Well, later I found out that the word Einfluss, which is the direct translation, is really associated with manipulation and the Hitler time. And so there would have to be a different word used to make it more neutral, even though that would be probably the first translation from English to German would be that word.
And what word do they use instead?
They told me überzeugen, to convince, would be more palatable. And I ran into that twice. The second time I was ready for it. And so I said, well, let's have a conversation about motivation, about influence, and about manipulation.
Huh. That's very interesting.
What are the distinctions among those?
Yes.
And how do you know?
That's fascinating, because of course that's a lot of those are a lot of factors in German history, recent German history.
Yes, yes, absolutely.
One of the other issues that you've stated, at least in your bio and in the introduction, is that words may be correct, but people may still not connect. And I think that's a wonderful way of saying it, and I think you've illustrated that. Is there anything else you'd like to elaborate about that one?
There are a number of those that we have. So how much change, for example, this can be a big one, and it can be a big one in mergers and acquisitions are particularly fraught with this. And they're fraught in a couple ways. First of all, because the acquirer has they expect people to just come along with their culture, because obviously it's better. Well, and so we call this being internal, making the decision based on your own internal factors. The other culture may feel that they have been doing things in a very good way, and there is no reason why they should. And so it becomes a clash, because both are in internal mode and they're expecting the other one to defer and say, "Oh, you're right."
Oh,
this is a huge, and so it's almost a recipe for disaster. And until you spend the time understanding the culture, and saying, well, what's important to you in this situation, and getting a lot of their language, you're not going to be able to be that effective. But once you get a lot of their language and their rationale and their standards, now you can offer your suggestions or your thoughts in the framework of their language and the way they see the world. And so that's hugely important, and it can be so subtle, in terms of just the expectation that I'm in charge, or I know more about this, and so you will defer to me. Also with change, if the person who's coming in and is the change agent will almost by default use changed language. Oh, we're going to transform this, things are going to be different, and so on. Well, if a culture, or of any company culture, people have been doing things the same way for a long time, then they have a sameness pattern. They're looking for, how is this similar to what I already know? And the minute they start hearing all of this change and transformation talk, they get terrified because they have no idea what this means. They have no way of, and so you'll bring someone in to be a change agent. They'll go out and tear up the pea patch with opposite language to the culture. And then they'll come back to the people who hired them and say, you never told me they were this resistant.
that's true. That's very funny, and very true. Do you find that this is the same in the United States and in Germany or in Europe, or are there other cultural factors involved as well?
Well, some of the larger scale cultural factors that we've talked about can be involved. And so you would want to be, if you're going to talk with someone who is German, first of all, you want to do something that it makes us either equals, or says, I'm wondering if you're thinking the same way about this. But then also, actually, the easiest way is to language it both ways and say, here is a goal that we have. And we have thought through some of the risks that might be involved.
Mm.
So now they can hear you because you've mentioned risk and you're not a scary person, right? There are some things, some of you will recognize this as being a change, but some of you will notice it's very much the same. We're still dedicated to customer service. We're still have these values. So then you can bring in the change, but you've connected with them. So that becomes something that is, and on a person-to-person basis, regardless of the culture, because some people may be different, you just listen to the way they're talking and explain what you want to say in both language, in both motivational triggers, in both styles. And that way they will just take the one that goes in, and you don't necessarily break rapport.
That's marvelous. Thank you. That's extremely insightful and very beneficial. Is there anything else you'd like to add before we conclude?
Only that what has become really clear to me when I was first learning German as a language, one of the statements I heard from someone was, when you learn another language, you acquire another soul.
Certainly another way of thinking.
Another way of thinking, and that was put in the term of soul. And it's really useful for people, I think, to understand that there's not just one way of thinking. I will still read online German newspapers to see how we're being perceived over here, and that there's another whole way of looking at it. And I think because we have had, only borders with Canada and Mexico, we've had no impetus to learn other languages and see things from other people's perspectives. And even if it's reading it in English, I think getting the perspective of other countries can be enormously valuable.
Very much so, as is international travel, as you well know as well.
Exactly.
Well, thank you so much. This has been a conversation with Dr. Ellen Moran, absolutely fascinating. Ellen is based in St. Louis, and her information will be on the podcast information. And I look forward to seeing you all next week for another edition of Global Gurus and their stories of international business. Thank you.
Thank you, Philip.